Okay, so welcome back to part two of chapter 33, an introduction to invertebrates. In part one, we have introduced the first group of species, now heading on to the second, which is your Lophotrichozoa, part of the bilaterian big group. So in this particular first phylum of Lophotrichozoa, we'll talk about the platyhelminths, which is also known as flatworms as their common names. And from the name of their common name itself, you can know that they are usually flattened. That's why they're called flatworms, and they are usually have thin, very thin bodies. And they're flattened dorsal ventrally. Remember, dorsal means the back, ventral means the tummy side. So for the back and the tummy are flattened. All right, and the habitat that flatworms live in are marine, freshwater, or damp terrestrial as well. Terrestrial means land living. They can be either freely living by themselves or they can also be parasitic. Their feeding method is usually involve fine branches of gastrulate cavity that distribute the food directly to the cells, kind of like how you had the cells that carry the amoebocytes from the sponge that carry food to the other cells. Now you have some kind of branches that distribute the food directly to the cells. Kind of now you have some sort of vascular system going on. And then waste removal for these flatworms are just diffusion, mainly due to, again, what I said about them being flat. It means that they don't have a lot of air, they don't have very thick cells or long distance for things to travel through. So whenever it's a thin surface, things can happen by diffusion. And being flat also increases the surface area of that particular animal, which then maximizes the amount of absorption and secretion it can do. All right, so there's two ancient lineages of the flatworms, which include the Catanulida and Rhaptophora. Okay, Rhaptophora. And so Catanulida actually have about 100 species. They're also called chain worms. They usually live in freshwater and will reproduce asexually by budding at the posterior end, which means the back end. And then you have offspring that is produced by these produce their own buds before they detach from the parents. So they have these, that's why they're called chain worms. They literally look like little things sticking out of their main body, and those things sticking out have their own offspring buds, and then they would just hatch off, detach from the parent as these chain worms. So we're not going to talk any more about that one. I think this textbook like to just mention those, mention those with small amount of species and only dive deep into detail with the ones that have a lot of species in it. So the other ancient lineage is the Rhabditophora, which has 20,000 species. They live in fresh marine environments. There are free living species. There's also parasitic species. We'll talk about free living species first. Those that are free living species are best known as planarians, and they tend to live in unpolluted ponds and streams in the wild. And they move by using cilia on the ventral surface, kind of like the hairy bellies we talk about. So if this is the dorsal side of the planarian, this then is the ventral side. Underneath here, there's a lot of cilia that helps with movement, and also they are able to secrete and glide along a mucus film, kind of like slugs. Slugs have to secrete this mucus film in order for them to glide. Same thing with planarians. The head actually has a pair of very light sensitive eye spots. Okay, they call it eye spots because it's not literally an eye, not like the human eye. Human eye is actually very complex. They are spherical with many, some layers to it, many structures to it. For these, they're simple eye spots. Okay, so that's why they call it eye spots instead of an actual eye. And there's these lateral flaps on each side of its head. They are there for detecting some chemicals around. And they actually have a pharynx that is looking like this, something sticking out of his tummy, mouth. So there's this mouth opening right there, and there's something that sticks out of that mouth, and that thing that sticks out can actually extend outwards when they need to. That's the pharynx. Know that pharynx for humans means throat. So the back of our throat is called the pharynx, and that's why this is called the pharynx, because it's going right next to the mouth. Now, more complex centralized nervous system happens in these flatworms compared with the other species we talked about with the cnidarians or the peripheras. So they have more centralized nervous system using ganglia. Ganglia usually means a group of neural cells. Okay, so that's why now you start to have a word ganglia because it's not just nerves, being distributed around. There's actually centralized neural cells that are in those particular specific areas. In this case, the planarian, you see this yellow kind of dense area. That's where the ganglia is. And then there's two, what's called the ventral nerve cords that goes down the tummy part of the planarians. Now, some of these planarians can reproduce asexually through fission. Fission means that they can actually separate the head and the tail parts. They say they constrict the middle of their body parts and then they separate, like cutting it right down the middle. And then the head part goes swimming, the tail part goes swimming, and then each of the head and tail part can regenerate the parts that are missing. So one planarian can become two planarian when you split down the middle like that. So the head will then grow the tail will then grow the head back, and now you have two identical, genetically identical planarians that is formed. Um, but they can do sexual reproduction as well. They are also hermaphrodites, just like cnidarians, just like the sponge, and they can cross fertilize, just as I've talked about with the sponge in sexual reproduction. All right, so the second group of platyhelminths is then the parasitic species, which include your trematodes and tapeworms. A lot of you are probably more familiar with tapeworms because you have heard of them before, probably, in your life. People always tell you, be careful, don't eat that raw meat because it can have tapeworms in it, especially pork. We'll get to that when we talk about details of the tapeworm. So let's talk about trematodes first. Trematodes are what's called blood flukes, as its common name, and they can and very commonly infect humans and cause a disease called schistosomiasis. Okay, schistosomiasis is where you can have a lot of pain, anemia, and also diarrhea. Now, life cycles for trematodes can alternate between sexual and asexual stages. We'll talk about that in a bit. And then they will require two hosts. Okay, they are a type of parasites. Remember, these are parasitic species. They cannot live on their own. They have to live inside another host. And for trematodes case, they are very interesting where they need two different hosts for their life cycle. They require what's called an intermediate host, which are usually snails. And inside the snails is where their larvae will develop, and then those larvae will swim out into the water and they will actually infect then their final host, which is usually a vertebrate of some sort, for example, humans. So they are actually then have these really cool adaptations because now they have to parasitize two different species. One is snails, one is vertebrates, which means by living in there, they have to somehow have the capacity to evade the immune systems of both hosts, and they do it by two different ways. One way is that they actually mimic the surface proteins of their hosts. Now, remember from Bio 1406, we talked about surface of a cell, and the surface of a cell might have glycoproteins that sticks out of the plasma membrane. And one function of those glycoproteins is for recognition purposes. I like to talk to them, discuss them kind of like analogous to driver license or your ID. So in order for the policeman to come by to know who you are, they ask for your ID. Are you allowed here? If you're not allowed here, they kick you out. So that's something with identification of some sort. Same thing with inside of our body cells. If it's our own cells have their own identification that tells your immune system, hey, I'm part of you, I'm part of this body, don't kill me. I'm not foreign. And that's how those surface proteins tell your immune system whether you're a self-generated cell or are you a foreign cell. Because if you are a foreign cell, your immune system will attack it, kill it, and destroy it before it causes any more harm. And in this case, this particular trematode parasite species, they are pretty smart. They are able to generate these surface protein that mimics ours, so that our immune system will think, oh, it's just your own, and they won't attack it. This type of mimic is called immunological camouflage. And camouflage, you already know what that means from previous chapter, that they can camouflage themselves from predators. In this case, this type of camouflage can hides the parasite inside our body and let them live. The second thing it does is that it can actually release molecules that manipulate the host immune system so that it can allow its existence. Kind of like it makes these little molecules to tell your immune system, hey, immune system, chill out. I'm something you can live with, so don't kill me. I can live inside of you. Okay. So that's the two things it can do in order for them to survive inside of your body. Now, because of how smart they are and they can evade your immune system via those two ways, some blood flukes can actually live in humans for more than 40 years. That's crazy. Which means that, if it's the symptoms is not severe enough, it can't kill you if they can live more than 40 years. So here are the trematodes life cycle right here. So this is showing you how they look like under the microscope, because they are microscopic. Males are usually generally a lot larger than the females. The female is actually, that tiny darker brown line you're seeing. And they say the way they mate is that the female kind of go and line itself into the groove of the male, so that the female actually end up binding inside of the male's body into that groove, and that's how they mate. Um, and so mature flukes usually live in blood vessels of human intestine, hence their name blood flukes, as they live in the blood vessels within intestine, always intestine, guys, because parasites, they are called parasites because they absorb nutrients from the host. And where do we absorb nutrients? It's not our stomach, it's not our face, okay? It is our intestine that is doing the majority of absorption of nutrients. So they know that's where the good stuff is. So they like to inhabit the intestine a lot of times. And on top of that, usually we ingest these parasites. So of course, then they somehow can reach all the way down to the intestine, down your alimentary canal. Now, blood flukes can reproduce sexually in human hosts, and they will fertilize. Their fertilized eggs will then go into your feces and urine. So um, sometimes, no, we're not talking about in our civilized world here, usually go to the toilet for eliminating our feces and urine. But think about in the wild, in countries where people have to pee and poop in the nature, in the ponds they see, or in the trees, or in the bushes, etc. So those feces can actually contain fertilized eggs of these blood flukes. Now, if somehow those feces and urine reach a water source of some sort, which is why some people will poop and urinate into some kind of lake or water. Now, if coming to that brings me an idea about the fact that sometimes, if we're talking about ships and, yachts, where where the yachts have a bathroom, a lot of that waste goes straight into the lake. So human waste can go into the lake that way as well. And I actually did a research program at Dallas College at Richland campus where we were sampling water samples from the White Rock Lake. And we were able to find some bacteria that live in the intestine. So, which mean live in human intestine for that matter, which means we know there's human waste material inside that lake. Don't go swimming in that lake, okay? White Rock Lake, because we have found human intestinal bacteria in there, which means there's human waste in that area. So let's say if someone infected with blood flukes, poop in the ship or the yacht, and then that feces and urine was then disposed into the lake. Now those fertilized eggs are free to roam, and they will become a ciliated larvae and infect snails if there are any snails around. And then the snails will then, inside the snails, those larvae will conduct asexual reproduction and form into your motile larva. Okay, so those eggs hatch within the snail, starts dividing by asexual reproduction, and then they hatch out of the snails as these larvae that can now swim around. And these larvae will then swim around in the lake looking for their final host, which could be a human. So once the larva reaches or able to reach a human, they will actually penetrate their skin and go into their blood vessel. I know this sounds scary. Yes, that's why I say don't be eating lunch at this moment when you're going over this part of the chapter. Now, once they go into your blood vessels, then they will, of course, infest in your intestinal area and live in there, mature in there, become sexually mature, and they will reproduce inside your intestine and start the whole process all over again, where they will then have fertilized eggs in your feces and urine. So if you somehow was swimming in that area with these larvae swimming, moving around, and they happen to penetrate you and go inside your skin, that's how you can get infected with blood flukes or trematodes. So that is then the life cycle of your blood fluke. All right, so the second type of parasitic species that's part of the phylum Platyhelminth is tapeworms. Now, tapeworms usually live in vertebrates where pigs and cattle are your intermediate hosts. So just like how trematodes have intermediate hosts and final hosts, tapeworms also have two levels of hosts. In terms of their anatomy, they have a scolex at the anterior end that kind of looks scary like that. It has at the very front or anterior part of its scolex, there are these hooked suckers. Okay, so they are, well, first of all, there are suckers here, and here's the hooks. So there's two suckers that kind of sucks the nutrients out of its host, and then the hook makes sure it goes into your tissues, into your intestinal lining, and attaches itself there. Even though all these feces and food is moving through it, it will be stuck there. It won't just flop off and go out because of the fact it has those hooks that can attach itself. Now, it does tapeworms do not have a mouth, do not have a gastrovascular cavity. They don't need those things because they don't need to capture prey and, push it in towards its mouth. All it does is just absorbing things that you eat and which are already liquid form. So that's why all they need is those suckers for taking all those nutrients in the digestive tract. Now, they also have what's called a proglottids. Okay, proglottids are right here, all of these. Okay, every one of these square-like thing, which is why when you look at tapeworms, in reality, they kind of look like segmented worms. Okay, because they're not actually segmented, but they just have these proglottids that form posterior. Once here's a scolex, every one of these things after the scolex are then the proglottis, which is the units that is capable of sexual reproduction. Each one of these can have fertilized eggs, and then they will leave through your feces, just like the trematodes. And once it leaves through the feces, let's say somehow it contaminated the food or the water that is fed to pigs and cattle, that's their intermediate host. That's the intermediate host. And those eggs within the pig or the cattle will then develop into larvae, and they actually encase themselves or encysst themselves into the muscles of the pigs. Because usually most generally consumed pork or pig parts are not the intestines or the internal organs. Usually we eat their meat, so that's, I guess they know that, and they insist themselves inside the muscles to make sure we humans will ingest them, and now we become the final host of these tapeworms. So if you eat any undercooked meat containing the larva, which is why you gotta make sure your pork or any type of meat is well cooked, or else you can ingest some of these tapeworm larvae into you. And these tapeworm larvae will then develop into mature adults within your intestine, and that will result, of course, in the nutritional deficiency. Now, with tapeworms, I want to mention a bizarre method of diet that has been used before. Of course, now that everyone knows is not the proper way to do things, is where they give you what's called a diet pill, and inside that pill is actually tapeworm larvae. And the tapeworm larva, once you ingest it, will then, of course, once your stomach kind of digests that outer pill, they would then go into your intestine and start colonizing over there, sexually reproducing in there, sucking nutrients out of you. That's why you cannot gain weight. So there were people that would feed tapeworm or ingest tapeworm themselves for as a method of losing weight. Please don't ever do that. Okay, your body needs the nutrients it's supposed to have. You will get into a very dangerous level of nutrient deficiency. Yes, you lose weight, but you are also damaging your organs and tissues. Okay, organs need a lot of different minerals, ions, nutrients to stay alive. When the tapeworm's taking everything away from you, you're taking nutrients away from your organs. You don't want to damage your organs due to nutrient deficiency. So this is why is not a good way of losing weight. Please don't ever do that. If you know someone that does that, tell them it's very dangerous for their body. And this is an image of the actual tapeworm winding around within an intestinal. This is the intestinal hollow space of this particular patient, and it has tapeworm living in there. Okay, so here's a quick video of tapeworms. They kind of have this scary music, just to, I guess, for drama.
Once inside human intestines, a tapeworm can grow to be 60 feet long. They have other adaptations that are equally amazing, but not very pretty. They have no eyes or mouths. Their heads have transformed into ghastly hooks and suckers that latch into the intestinal wall. With a secure hold inside the gut, they can proceed with their main task, making more tapeworms. The worm's body is a conveyor belt, cranking out tiny breeding machines. Each one produces sperm and eggs, generating huge batches of offspring. In fact, the number of eggs generated by even one tapeworm exceeds the total number of human beings alive on Earth.
Isn't that crazy? That is crazy.
Few of the worm's embryos will survive in the outside world, but those that do have plenty of places where they can go.
Okay, so that's just a quick video showing you their reproduction and how they look like, in those scanning electron microscopy pictures, which is pretty cool. All right, so then that's it for the Lophotrochozoa flatworm phyla, the platyhelminths. So now moving on to the next phylum called the Cindermata, which includes species that are called rotifers and acanthocephalans. Again, rotifers and acanthocephalans used to be classified as separate phyla. Nowadays, they know they actually share a lot of similarities with our, technological advance. So they are now considered as one phylum called Cindermata. Now, we'll start by talking about rotifer first. Rotifers' habitat are usually freshwater, marine, or damp soil. In a lot of cases, invertebrates seems to like those particular habitats. You'll see the similarities between all the phyla. Rotifers' feeding method is that they actually vortex water into their mouth, followed by digestion. Kind of like the sponge, but there's more complex organs within the rotifers. Rotifers are microscopic animals that look kind of like this, and they do have an alimentary canal. Alimentary canal is defined as a digestive tube with two openings. One is the mouth. One end of the tube is the mouth. One end of the tube is then the anus. So for this rotifer species, here's the mouth, which is really right here, and then here's the anus right there that allows food to be dislodged out into the environment. So food kind of in the water, from the water, kind of get vortex in through the mouth, and then they kind of go through the alimentary canal out the anus. Now, there are internal organs for this particular species of rotifers. They are within hemocoel. Hemocoel, that's why you see all these lumps. Those are all your organs. That's the stomach right there. And all of these organs are suspended within the hemocoel, where the fluid inside the body serves as the hydrostatic skeleton, just like we talked about with hemocoels. Because they don't have hard skeletons on there. And then their body movements is what distributes the nutrients throughout the body. I already talked, the mouth is located right here, and you see that there are all these little lines sticking out. That's the crown of cilia that we talked about to draw in water from the surrounding, and then it goes through the mouth into what's called the jaws. I know you're like, that doesn't look like a jaw, but they consider this as a jaw called trophy because it does the job of grinding up the food, okay, because that's what jaws are for, is to mechanically digest the food by grinding them up. And in this case, any microorganism that has happened to be vortexed into the mouth of the rotifers will be smushed and crushed by the jaws within here before moving on to the rest of the alimentary canal, including the stomach. Now, rotifer reproduction are usually what's called parthenogenesis. Again, a very different type of reproduction compared to most of the sexual reproduction we know. This particular species, most of it, only have females, which means female somehow is able to produce more females from unfertilized eggs. So these eggs don't have sperm, but somehow these eggs are able to become adult females by asexual reproduction. So that's why it's called parthenogenesis, meaning that it's kind of partially regenerating the reproduction, where it's not making males. It can only make females from this no when there's no fertilization happening. Now, some rotifers can reproduce sexually under high levels of crowding conditions, meaning that they're so packed next to each other that somehow they can reproduce sexually. Embryos can actually remain dormant for years once this has occurred, and then these embryos will then develop into another generation of females that will reproduce asexually. So those sexual reproduction is very rare for this particular species of rotifers, but they mainly go by asexual reproduction, which is why their species are predominated by females. Okay, and that's all about rotifers. And if you look up videos of rotifers, they just look like little drilling machines swimming around everywhere, and waiting for water to go through itself and ingesting microorganisms along the way. The second group of species under this Syndermata phylum is the acanthocephalin, which its feeding method, it is another parasite. That's why it has hooks like this, again, just like the tapeworm. And then all these parasites just tend to look like worms, because I guess that's how their body shapes like, so they can easily fit into our intestines. So they don't have a complete digestive tract. They're commonly called spiny headed worms because of the fact they have these hooks. They're curved hooks that make sure they can hook onto and attach to their host. They're on the proboscis at the anterior end of the particular parasites, but they do have a hemocoel. Now, for acanthocephalans, the way they reproduce is they have a complex life cycle with, again, two or more hosts, not just one intermediate host. There could be multiple intermediate hosts. Usually for these acanthocephalans, they have their intermediate hosts are not snails. Oh, actually, yeah, they're arthropods, which are then mud crabs, is usually their host. Final hosts are then usually vertebrates, which are, for example, birds. So in this case, they are not commonly found in humans, they are commonly found in birds. Um, So some species can actually manipulate the behavior of their intermediate host. Now, this part of it is bizarre to me. So they say they can somehow change the particular host's behavior. So in the case of these, in an example of infected New Zealand mud crabs, usually crabs don't like to hang out on the beach because if they're hanging out on the bare, big exposed beach, they can easily be attacked by predators such as birds. So crabs like to burrow into the sand, or they will go out into the ocean and hide under the ocean floor while crawling around the ocean floor. But supposedly, if they're infected with this particular acanthocephalans, they're able to manipulate these mud crabs' behavior and let them hang out into the open beach. And they will be more, in that sense, they can have an easier time for birds to eat them, which is then their final host. So that's really bizarre. It's like, I'm not going there because I don't want to be dead, but this thing is inside of me telling me to go there. Crazy, right? Kind of sounds like a apocalyptic movie or something. But that's what this particular parasite can do, is that they can manipulate the behavior of their host so they can be easier eaten, have an easier time be eaten by the predator, and that particular predator is then this species' final host, which is bird in this case. All right, then moving on to the other two phyla of the Lophotrochozoa group, which is the ectoprocs and the brachiopods. So for these two phyla, they have habitats that are again marine, but compared to the other things we've talked about, they are sessile, which means they don't move. Okay, for both ectoprocs and brachioprocs. If they can't move, they are usually just sitting there, either with tentacles that can trap suspended food particles, and then they have cilia that can draw water towards the mouth. So either way, either you just sit there and allow water to come through the mouth, just like your sponge and other creatures we've talked about, or you have kind of like hydras, in where they have tentacles that can, grab the prey and put them into their mouth. So anatomy of ectoprocs and brachiopods is that they usually have a lophophore, which is again that crown ciliated tentacles around the mouth. They have a U-shaped alimentary canal. They don't really have a distinct head of any sort, and then they have a coelom though. So here is an example of ectoprocs, which is usually live in colonies that resemble clumps of moss. So if you were to look at them on the ocean floor, they look like a carpet of moss is what we see. And their colony is encased in hard exoskeleton. Now this is something different from moss or hydras. They have this exoskeleton that is studded with pores on them that allows for that water, being drawn into its body. And lophophores is, here's the lophophores were all these kind of like lamp, upside down lamp shape thing, or a little, what do you call that? Lamp, the trombone, those musical instruments. So lophophores extends from those pores that are within the exoskeleton that allows for, allow for it to eat. And then the other phyla of Lophotrochozoa is the brachiopods, or also known as lamp shells. They kind of resemble clams if you look at it like in this picture here, and they are made up of two halves of shell that are dorsal and ventral instead of lateral like the clam. So it looks like a clam, but not exactly like a clam because of the way that their halves are are structured. And then they live attached to the sea floor by a stalk. So even though you can't really see it, there is a stalk below that, in this sense, remember they are sessile creatures that can't move. So they're immovable, non-mobile clams in a sense. And then their shell kind of opens slightly like this to allow water to flow through the lophophore. So inside of the two halves of the shell is a lophophore that allows for that filtering of water going through itself and ingesting those food particles that are coming in. Okay, and then you have the phylum Mollusca. Okay, again, another phylum under the group Lophotrochozoa. Mollusca is a pretty diverse species with snails, slugs, oyster clams, octopuses, and squids. So we'll talk about each of them in a bit. Of course, their main habitat is marine or freshwater. For snails and slugs, they can actually live on land, whereas the other ones cannot. Feeding method is that they have what's called a radula. And that radula kind of acts like a little broom that scrapes up the food as the animal is moving across the surface of their food source. Waste removal, they have what's called uh, metanephridia that will move the metabolic waste from the hemolymph into the exterior environment. So here is their anatomy. Kind of complex, but we have went over it in lab. So for mollusk, they are usually soft body on the inside, but they are protected by a hard shell that the inside soft body will secrete. Again, these shells are made up of calcium carbonate, and all of these mollusks usually have shells other than slugs, squids, and octopuses. And that is, logic. Just imagine how they look like if you know how slugs and squids and octopus look like. Now, their primary body cavity is a hemocoel. Okay, and there's your hemocoel all here, all these tan area. This entire space is a hemocoel, and it has a coelom too, but a very reduced one right here. Okay, the blue is a coelom, and then the tan is the hemocoel. Now, body has a muscular foot at the bottom right here for movement purposes, and above the foot is what we call a visceral mass. This visceral mass is what contains all the internal organ of the mollusk, including a mantle, which is this blue layer right here. This mantle is what is really a fold of tissue that drapes over the visceral mass, and it is the thing or part or the structure of a mollusk that secretes a shell. So it's kind of like how you have, those cells that produce exoskeletons or some kind of hard spicules in the sponge. Now you have a part of the structure called mantle that will secrete the shell of the mollusk. Mantle may extend beyond the visceral mass like this because the visceral mass ends right where the tan area is. So the mantle kind of can extend over that, which then creates a fluid filled chamber called the mantle cavity. And inside this mantle cavity is where we can have gills, the anus right there, and also other excretory pores that needs to be expelling things will be coming out from here. Remember, this is a general anatomy structure of mollusk, not a particular species. They may look different from each other, as we can tell. This that looks nothing like an octopus, but it's just saying these are general feature that mollusks should have. So it also have what we call kind of like they call it a strap like. I would say that kind of looks like a conveyor belt with hooks on it. That's what the radula is. So as that creature or mollusk is moving along some kind of substrate at the bottom, and as their food source, let's say algae is moving, is growing on this substrate, as it moves, all of these conveyor belt of hooks will scrape along that substrate, digging into it and putting algae into its mouth and then onto its digestive organs. And that's how it is able to eat. So it's a belt of what they call backward curved teeth that will scrape up food into itself, into the digestive tract. So this whole pink coil here is the digestive tract. And it is coiled within the visceral mass itself, and then it is the metanephridium right here that removes waste from the hemolymph. Okay, now it does have some sort of a heart organ. We call it a heart because it is a pump, but it is not a closed system. Mollusks have an open circulatory system. What do you mean by open? Is that there is no closed end. It's not a circuit of blood vessels we're talking about. It's a heart with a tube sticking out this way, and that tube has no closed end. It's open into the whole visceral mass space. So as the pump the heart pumps fluid or water through, okay, the hemolymph through, hemolymph is going to be spread across the entire visceral mass, and it is by diffusion that then, will where nutrients can be absorbed and also waste can be removed. And I think, there's one person, well, a speaker that talked about it as kind of like a little jacuzzi, okay, where you have this jacuzzi of a chute of water fluid coming out of the jacuzzi. Same thing here. You have this pump that pumps the hemolymph into the visceral mass of this particular mollusk. So this is what we mean by open circulatory system. There's not heart and then blood vessels going around and then end back at the heart. That's what we call a closed circulatory system. Here is just a heart with a tube, and that tube is open, dangle like that somewhere in the body, and water and the hemolymph or blood is just gushing out of it and distribute throughout the cavity. All right, before reproduction, mollusk most of them have separate sexes, and their gonads are located within the visceral mass itself. So for this particular mollusk, there's that gonad within the general structure. Snails are the exception, where they are hermaphrodites, where they can become a male or a female sequentially. And then marine mollusk lifestyle includes what we call a ciliated larval stage. And it's that trophophore we talked about. Hence, that's why it's part of the Lophotrochozoa group of animal species. All right, so continue on with mollusk. Four of the eight groups of mollusk will be discussed. There's eight total. We will only discuss details of the four. First of them is called polyplacophora, which is chitons, gastropoda, which are your snails and slugs, bivalvia, which is the clams and oyster, cephalopoda, which is the squids, octopuses, cuttlefishes, which is usually don't have a shell other than the chamber nautiluses. We'll talk about that when we get there. All right, so let's start with the first group of species under the phylum Mollusca, which is chitons. Chitons are also called polyplacophora. They are actually unsegmented, even though their body kind of looks like they have segments. They're actually unsegmented, okay? They have this oval shaped body and has a shell with 8 dorsal plates on top of it. So it's not segments of body, it's just dorsal plates that protect over its soft body. Usually they cling to rocks along the shore, and the foot on the bottom actually grips very tightly to the rock. If you ever see one and try to lift one up, it would be almost impossible. They are very, very strong. And they usually ingest algae with their radula, just as we've talked about, with the general structure of the mollusk. Gastropod is the second group of species within the phylum Mollusca. These include your snails and slugs, which usually for snails, they have a single spiral shell as protection against injury or dehydration. And then they also use a rippling motion of their foot or by cilia to move along their whatever environment they are living in. Most will ingest algae or dead plants or plants in general with their radula. Some have radula modified for boring holes into the shells of other mollusks. So some of these guys will eat other mollusks as well and tear it apart with their radula. Cone snails, for example, their radula have teeth that actually act like poison darts that would subdue the prey, immobilize it, and allow it to ingest it afterwards. So different, gastropods will have different radula for their eating purposes or defense purposes. The eyes are usually located at the tip of the tentacles on top of the head, right there or right here. And for terrestrial gastropods, they usually don't have gills because they don't live in water. That's why they don't need gills. But the lining of their mantle cavity will then act as their lungs. third group of species is called bivalves. Bivalves are again clam, oyster, mussels, or scallops. Their shell, this we talked about it with the brachiopods, saying that they're not exactly the same halves as these bivalves. So for bivalves, their two halves are hinged at one end and actually closed very tightly by adductor muscles for protection. And they're halved at the lateral side of their body. Um, so there's these adductor muscles. If you have taken human anatomy before, we have adductor muscles in our thighs for closing our thighs. Same thing here. They're trying to close their shell very tight against any predators or danger. So that's why they have these adductor muscles that will contract really tightly to close up the shell. Now there's no distinct head with bivalves. They don't have a radula like the other mollusks do. Again, that's why I said the other anatomy picture of the mollusk is just a general anatomy. Not true, is not necessarily true for every single group of mollusks we're talking about here. Now, some do have eyes and sensory tentacles along the outer edge of the mantle, and if there's any, they will stick out of the bivalves, the shells that way there. And then within that's why there's a separate anatomy picture of the bivalves. There are gills that is used for both respiratory means. There's a gill, which is this portion right here, the segmented portion. It is both for gas exchange and also for feeding purposes. Because they don't move constantly. They sometimes just, once they find a spot they like, they can stay there. So they are suspension feeders. That's why they don't need a radula in that case. They can trap food particles within the mucus and then use cilia to move the food into its mouth. So the gill would suck in water, and within the water, whatever food particles within the water will be trapped and filtered by the gills, and then they will go on into their digestive system. Now, with these mollusk bivalves, they have an in-current siphon and an ex-current siphon because they are suspension feeders. They rely on water moving through their body in order to eat. So in-current siphons will allow water to enter the mantle cavity, go through. So here's the water flow. Oops. Okay, here's the water flow coming in from the in-current siphon, which then goes through the gills and then out the gills into the ex-current siphon. So then whatever the mollusk doesn't need, the bivalves doesn't need, it will just come right out of the ex-current siphon. They are usually sedentary, but they can move if they need to. I'll show you movements of them in a bit. So, depending what creature you are of the bivalves, some will move, some won't move. For mussels, they actually secrete threads that tether them to rocks, which means mussels don't move. Clams, on the other hand, can actually pull themselves into the sand or mud and burrow in there, and they actually have a muscular foot that will stick out of its shell and use that foot as an anchor. I'll show you this in a bit. It's a pretty interesting process. The last and most cool movement is made by scallops. Scallops, these are movements called skittering. So they kind of skitter by flapping their shells. And the book literally says that they look like artificial teeth. You know those toys that with artificial teeth chattering away and bouncing away? That's how scallops look like when they move. And I had to look it up on YouTube to see how they move when I saw that. And it was kind of funny. So let's look at the clam first. So this is the clam movement that can be done by the clams. But you see how there's that little thing sticking out at the end? In the beginning, it's kind of slow, but it will eventually move. Now, you see there's that little thing sticking out. It senses danger. I'm out in the open. I got a burrow inside, so there's that foot coming out and just digging and digging their way. And it eventually goes into the mud or the sand with this repeated movements. I thought that was pretty cool. I mean, you don't tend to think of clams as moving creatures, and I've never seen that live, like in reality before, in real life. Ooh. So there's that siphoning thing we talked about with the sand coming out like that. Okay, and the second one, it's funny. You have to watch this. Don't skip over this. The way scallops move are so funny, and this video used me match the music to the comical way they move. Get ready? Move! They kind of skitter around like that. I thought it was kind of cool. Very fast swimmers, but they're trying to run away from you. And how does those bursts of fan and back of it? So I thought that was really cool because I've never seen scallops run away like that. That literally looks like a scene from a cartoon or something, but that's how scallops move, which is exactly like the book described it. A little skittering action of artificial teeth toy. Oh, I don't want. Okay. All right. So continuing on, even though those are funny, we must move on with the chapter. So here is the fourth type of mollusca called cephalopods, which are including your squid species, your octopus species, cuttlefishes, and also something called chamber nautilus, which is the only cephalopod that have an enlarged shell. So all of these uses tentacles to grasp their prey and then bite with what looks like a beak jaws that will expel poison within their saliva to immobilize their prey. So if you have watched Finding Nemo, there's that big squid that tried to eat Nemo and Dory, excuse me, Marlin and Dory while they're looking for Nemo. So that literally at the bottom, that beak-like thing that go chomping at them, trying to chomp at them, it's what that look like, is what cephalopod's mouth looks like. And they move by drawing water into their mantle cavity, and then they fire a jet of water through an X current siphon, and that will expel that water out, and then they will dart forward. So that's why, if we compare cephalopods to the other mollusca species, they actually move a lot faster, and they are actually able to steer which way they want to go really quickly by pointing the siphon in different directions, kind of like a speedboat, if you imagine it that way. Speedboat has a pump in the back, an engine in the back that allows you to have all this water coming out in the back so that when you spit out water, it will pump the boat forward. Same thing here for octopuses and squids, is that they will expel that water, which propel their body very quickly forward, and then they can actually, change directions whichever way they want to go. Now, the mantle covers what's called the visceral mass, as we've talked about. And, like I said, that their shells are usually either reduced or internal, or they're completely missing in these cephalopods. The only exception with cephalopods that have an enlarged shell are the chamber nautiluses, which they are really cool creatures. I looked up a video of them swimming around, and I just love looking at them at the aquarium. But it's kind of boring. They're just swimming around. So I didn't want to, add to the timing we had within this chapter. But these chamber nautiluses are really cool creatures, and they're the only ones with shells as part of the group cephalopods. So this is the only mollusk with a closed circulatory system, which is why I said again, going back to the general anatomy is not true for every single mollusk. The general one didn't have a closed circulatory system. For cephalopods, these are the only mollusks that have a closed circulatory system where blood is actually separate from the fluid in the body cavity. And they have very well developed sense organs, and they say they have a very complex brain as well, because they are actually able to learn and behave in a very complex manner. Now, I don't know if you've watched this dude, this speaker on YouTube that I like to watch. I love to watch animal videos. That's on my YouTube videos sometimes. But this speaker actually have like to help squids, excuse me, octopuses as pets in his aquariums, and he will rescue octopuses as well, or people would call him up and say, hey, there's this octopus that we can't we can't host, so please have take care of him. So, and the way he does shows these videos is that they show how these octopuses have these behavior where if he comes out to play with them, they like it. They like it when you approach them. They do want to go through puzzles to get their food, because if it's just food be fed to them into their mouths, they get bored. If you give them some puzzles to solve, they can actually figure it out. Like, even if you've never taught them how to solve it before, eventually they will figure out how to get to the food source, maybe by squeezing through a hole here, opening some place here or there. So that's why they say cephalopods have very well developed sense organs and also a complex brain in order to exhibit those behaviors. Some squids, scarily have giant sizes. Most squids we see are palm size or a little bigger than our palm, but there are humongous squid out there, and there's two species of them that have been found in nature. One is called the giant squid, one is called colossal squid. They are estimated around 14 meters, which is here's that little squid that we usually see. Here's the giant squid. Here's the colossal squid, super humongous. And they say their tentacles have two rows of these sharp hooks on them, and they think it is what they use to lash at their prey and be able to eat large fishes deep in the ocean, because usually they're not at the surface of the water. They're usually deep inside, deep, very, very deep into the ocean. And for giant squid, there are people that have been able to capture live on camera, by giving some kind of bait for them to come by. So they have seen giant squid, but colossal squid is still uncaptured or unseen as a moving live organism. There's no footage of seeing colossal squid swimming yet. They've only seen dead ones. Usually, how we discover these giant squids is by maybe a big sperm whale that's dead, and they've been washed up on shore, and inside the stomach of these sperm whales is where they found giant squid or carcasses of colossal squid, which is why even the whole colossal squid is hard to find, because a lot of times they find pieces or broken and damaged colossal squid inside the sperm whale's stomach, and they say sperm whale is probably their only predators because of how large these colossal squids are. And imagine how long a meter stick is, and then you have 14 of those. Okay, that's how big that squid is. A lot bigger than us humans. All right, and then you have another phylum, the last phylum of the Lophotrochozoa group, which are the annelids. They literally mean little rings, which kind of represent their segmented body, because their body looks like a series of fused rings on themselves. So these annelids are really segmented worms that resembled some rings on their body. Their habitat can be marine, freshwater, or damp soil. Anatomy is that they have coelom but no hemocoel. And they are divided into two major groups, Urantia and Sedentaria. And by their name, you already know their movements, because Sedentaria sounds like sedentary, which means they don't move very much or move very slowly. Urantia kind of sounds like erratic, so they move kind of faster and they're more freely moving in general. So each body segment has a pair of paddle-like or ridge-like structures, just like you can see here, called parapodia. So each one of these is a segment of the body, and each segment has this pair of parapodia that sticks out of it and allow it to swim and move. It also serves as gills for these particular animals. Now, each parapodium has many what's called chaetae, okay, chaetae, which are bristles made up of chitin. Chitin, if you remember from Bio 1406, we did mention this macromolecule as a as what's formed on the exterior surfaces of exoskeletons of crustaceans, for example, or insects. We talked about cellulose on that protects plants, and then what protects insects and crustaceans are chitin. So for this, chitin is then bristles that is made up of that chitin material. And so all of these things are pretty tough things that are sticking out and help them move, and also as protection. They also have well-developed jaws for ingesting food, and then they have sensory organs as well. And then this particular interesting annelid, this one right here, is actually called Christmas tree worm. You can see why they're called Christmas tree worm because they literally look like two Christmas trees on top of the worm at the bottom here. So these tree-shaped things are actually tentacles that is used for gas exchange. All of these are tentacles, and each tentacles are attached to a tube made up of calcium carbonate that is secreted by the worm to protect and support the body. That's how these worms move around and protect themselves. And then sedentarians is then tube-dwelling annelids that has gills and also tentacles that is used for filter feeding, either for food or gas exchange. So they do have gills for sedentarians. They may move around or move very slowly. One example of sedentarian, again, it's another scary creature, is are leeches. So leeches have blade-like jaws that actually is able to slit their host skin. Wow, this is the scary part. They don't let you know they're cutting you open by secreting an anesthetic. So the host don't even know something bit them because as soon as a host know, like humans, us humans, if we know someone bite us, we will like look at it and try to yank it off, something like that. Well, for leeches, they secrete this anesthetic so that we don't even know something bit us. And second thing it secretes is hirudin. Well, they're trying to suck your blood in for these leeches as their food source. So they don't want their cut or your injury sites to be clotting. So hirudin is what keeps the host blood from clotting near around the bite so they can continuously suck blood out without having to combat and make another cut open because your cut already start to clot. So they can stick on you and can suck as long as they want, up to 10 times its weight. That's crazy. Once they have that much blood inside of them, they will then be able to live on that for months. So now that's the scary part of leeches, but interestingly, leeches have beneficial usage as well. Yes, they suck our blood when we don't want them to, but there are cases when we want to use them for taking blood out. So there are blood draining methods that where leeches can be used to drain the blood from accumulating in tissues after injury or surgery. So let's say there is some kind of bulge forming on part of your body where it is from the surgery itself. Somehow blood have seeped into this area, thus creating some kind of discomfort structure within your body. So then they will put the leech on there so that the leech can then suck the blood out of that area and be able to drain the blood in a sense without any surgical tools. And then they also have been able to form some kind of synthesized hirudin because they see, oh, this is what nature makes. Let's mimic what it does, and we humans will synthesize our own version of hirudin that can actually dissolve unwanted clots during a surgery or for people with heart disease. Because for those people, clotting tends to happen because of surgeries when we cut open blood vessels, and blood vessels, when we bleed, is just our natural human response to close up that wound and start clotting. But we don't want that to happen in surgeries or in a person with heart disease. We don't want abnormal clotting to be contributing to atherosclerosis that can lead to heart attack, etc., or stroke for that matter. So that's why hirudin was synthesized by humans as a way to that mimic the hirudin that is released by leeches, just like how the cryostatin was generated by sponge. We make our own versions based off of that. So humans learn a lot from nature, and then that's how we're able to come up with new things based on what nature has. All right. And then your other group of annelids or type of sedentarians are then your earthworms, which we introduced in the quick gloss over of the Lophotrochozoa. Earthworms do eat through soil, and along with that, they will extract nutrients as the soil passed through their entire alimentary canal, which is this pink tube you're seeing within the earthworm. Any undigested material will just be eliminated as fecal castings through the anus. Well, earthworms, even though, some people don't like worms, they are actually very beneficial for agricultural purposes. Farmers actually use earthworms because as these earthworms are, burrowing through the soil, they would till and aerate the soil. And then when they, release these fecal casting, the casting actually improve texture of the soil. So I've seen, fertilizers or people that, you guys know I like plants. So they say that some people will put worm castings into the soil for plants because they know that is beneficial for the soil itself. So I've seen worm casting being sold, and people would, mix it in with their soil and fertilizer so that they can be good and beneficial for the plant growth. So that's why farmers use it too. And then, so for earthworms, they are hermaphrodites in terms of reproduction, where they will cross fertilize, and one earthworm will align themselves with another earthworm in the opposite directions, and that's where they will exchange sperm because they are hermaphrodites. Both of them can produce sperm and eggs at the same time. So some can reproduce asexually, also by fragmentation or regeneration. Now, for anatomy parts of the earthworm, you have chetae, just like before, chetae, which each segments actually have four pairs of them for traction. So if you look very, very close at this picture here, or at this picture, there's little sticks coming out of its body. That's the chetae. And then at the head, you have something called the cerebral ganglia that acts like a brain, for the worm itself. And then there's ventral nerve cords that will run through the length of the body to distribute those electrical signals, telling things when to contract and allow it to move. And then it does have a closed circulatory system where there's hearts and blood vessels, and there's skin has vessels that also function as a respiratory organ because there's no lungs in there. So these blood vessels on top of their, and close to the skin is where they are doing gas exchange for the earthworm itself. And then it also has a metanephridium, which is each segment has a pair of this excretory tubes. If you look right here, metanephridium. So these green things here are then your excretory tubes, which will discharge the waste from your blood, circulating from your coelomic fluid, and then allow those fluid to be excreted through exterior pores. Coelom is partitioned by the septa. So you can see here is they didn't show the septa here. Septum. Okay, so that's the septum that is separating each segment of coelom within the earthworm. All right, and that is all for Liphotrichozoa, the longest section of this chapter. We are again at 1 hour 7 minutes, which is a perfect stop before we move on to the other, the ecdysozoa and the deuteriostomia.